The desert night was alive with silence, a silence so deep it pressed against the ears like thunder. A single flare of lamplight flickered within a goatskin tent pitched amid ragged dunes. Inside that fragile refuge a woman lay awake, listening to her own heart and to the steady breath of the child who slept beside her. At that moment she could not know that centuries later poets would still whisper her name in wonder and in grief. But on that night, as the stars stared down with a cold and radiant curiosity, Hagar understood one thing with perfect clarity. Exile has a voice, and it calls a person by every hidden fear. She drew her son closer and tried to silence both the wind and the terror rising inside her. She did not yet grasp that the wilderness itself was about to awaken with a reply. Abraham had been an old man, gray-bearded, sun-hardened, limbs as gnarled as olive branches, when hope first cracked open the long-sealed door of his life. His wife, Sarah, had watched the passing of seasons without ever feeling the quickening of a child beneath her ribs. In those days, men measured wealth by flocks and tents. Yet in all his abundance, Abraham carried the invisible wound of empty arms. Sarah felt that wound, too, and the wound became an echo in their marriage, an echo that grew louder each passing year until it could no longer be ignored. One evening dusk bleeding to violet, Sarah stepped into her husband's tent, carrying a solution born of ancient custom and private desperation. She presented her Egyptian maidservant Hagar, with trembling fingers but steely resolve, and she spoke words that tasted like both ash and honey. "Take her," she said, "and perhaps through her the promise will finally breathe." Hagar lowered her eyes, hearing the rustle of fate, yet unable to stop it. She had been purchased with silver from a caravan bound north out of the Nile's fertile arms. Now she was offered like fertile ground herself, soil in which another woman's dream might root and bloom. Months slipped by as silently as foxes in the night. Then one early morning, with dawn pushing a pale ribbon along the horizon, Hagar felt the sudden tightening within her womb. Life had sparked. She cried out, half in pain, half in astonishment, and the camp awakened to a prophecy concealed in flesh and blood. Abraham named the boy Ishmael. God hears, because an angel had whispered that promise in a dream. The old man's laugh that day was the laugh of water released from a dam after a lifetime of drought. But joy carries a shadow, and the shadow lingered around Sarah. Once she had believed herself barren beyond remedy. Now she believed herself displaced within her own tent. Every time Ishmael's laughter rang out, it seemed to mock the emptiness of her arms. Jealousy, that swift serpent, coiled in her chest. She struck with words, with glances, with the subtle cruelty of one who fears becoming invisible. Hagar, empowered by motherhood yet shackled by servitude, met Sarah's scorn with a pride she did not know she possessed. Two women, bound by the same man and an opposite longing, became planets caught in rival orbits, each tugging against the other's tides. Years passed. The boy grew strong, lean, desert swift. He chased gazelles through scrub, learning the art of the bow with uncanny intuition. Abraham watched him with mingled pride and a sorrow he scarcely acknowledged. Then, like lightning illuminating the night, the unthinkable happened. Sarah felt the stirring of life within her own body. She laughed a laugh so wild it startled the doves from their roost, and when she held her own son, Isaac, she believed every bruise upon her heart had finally been soothed. Yet wounds recall their old ache. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham prepared a feast that filled the air with the scent of roasted lamb and sweet cakes drenched in honey. Ishmael, nearly a man by then, stood at the edge of the celebration, shading his eyes against the sun. He watched his little brother toddle about, and some say he mocked. Others say he merely played. In either case, Sarah's heart read danger in the tilt of his grin. She approached Abraham that night, moonlight slicing the tent in silver stripes, and demanded what love alone had not the nerve to voice. Send the slave woman away. Her son will never share the inheritance with mine. Abraham's spirit cracked. He had heard God in windswept visions, had followed a voice into unknown lands, but this request struck like a spear. Yet the same voice that once summoned him from yore now whispered again, "Do as she asks. Trust the story I weave beyond your sight." So, with dawn still hiding beneath the horizon, Abraham placed bread and a skin of water upon Hagar's shoulders. The boy Ishmael stood beside her, eyes wide, fingers clutching a bundle of arrows he would not surrender. Abraham's farewell was a river of unspoken words dammed behind ancient pride. Hagar waited for a reason, a mercy, a second thought, but none arrived. They walked into the desert of Beersheba, that barren cradle where life and death negotiate without pity. The first day, the sun forged iron spears of heat that stabbed the sand. The second day, thirst became a feverish phantom clawing at their throats. By the third, the water-skins sagged flat as wind-dead sails. When Ishmael stumbled, exhaustion buckling his knees, Hagar dragged him beneath a scant thorn bush. She stepped away the distance of a bowshot, for the sight of her dying child threatened to rip her soul from her body. She lifted her face and screamed without sound, a howl consumed by the desert's devouring silence. Then she broke, tears falling onto parched ground that could not drink them. In that desolation, a whisper brushed the burnt air. "What troubles you, Hagar?" The voice carried neither rebuke nor condescension. It was water against stone, gentle yet urgent. "Do not fear." Hagar opened her eyes and beheld an angel of the Lord, shimmering like mirage yet solid as truth. "God has heard the boy where he is. Rise, lift him up, for I will make him a great nation." As the words pulsed through her, something even more startling happened. Her eyes cleared, and she saw what despair had hidden: a well, deep and clear, a mirror of the sky sunk into the earth. She ran, filled the skin till it overflowed, and pressed the cool water to Ishmael's cracked lips. The boy drank, and life returned like dawn, rolling back the night. Thus began their second exile, but now the wilderness bore a promise alongside its peril. They roamed the desert of Paran, where sandstorms roared like dragons and stars gleamed like spearheads in an ink-black vault. Ishmael's arms grew sinewed with strength. His arrows flew truer than hooks. Traders learned to speak his name with respect, sometimes with fear, for he could track a caravan's footprint across bare stone and strike a jackal through both eyes at 40 paces. Yet within him burned more than mere survival. He carried a memory, the moment when heaven bent low enough for his mother to see her own reflection in God's watching eyes. He carried also a question: if God hears, what then is he calling me to become? Years unfurled like banners in the wind. Word reached them, carried on merchant tongues, that Father Abraham had died at a ripe age, and that Ishmael's kin awaited his presence at the burial cave of Machpelah. A choice now lay before the desert archer: remain a wanderer, or journey back toward the tents of memory and grief. The road north wound through valleys, haunted by echoing ghosts' old resentments, unspoken goodbyes, and Ishmael knew each mile would taste of salt, tears, and reconciliation alike. He turned his face toward the past and stepped forward. The road to Hebron stretched before Ishmael like a covenant written in dust and stone. Each step carried him deeper into a geography of memory, where every ridge and valley whispered with the ghosts of his childhood. The sun, that merciless judge of the desert, beat down upon his weathered shoulders as he guided his small caravan northward. Behind him rode his son's 12 young men, whose eyes held the fierce gleam of hawks, and whose hands knew the weight of both sword and bow. They were princes in their own right, leaders of tribes that bore their names. Yet today they followed their father into a past that none of them fully understood. Ishmael had lived 89 years, and most of those years had been spent learning the language of survival. The wilderness of Paran had been his teacher, its harsh lessons carved into the sinews of his body and the depths of his soul. He had become what the angel prophesied, a master archer whose arrows never missed their mark. A man whose hand was quick to defend and whose heart was slow to trust. 22. It had also made him solitary, like a wolf that hunts alone beneath indifferent stars. Yet as the familiar landmarks of Canaan began to appear, the ancient terebinth trees, the stone cairns that marked tribal boundaries, something stirred within him that he had thought long buried. It was not quite hope, for hope was a luxury he had learned to live without. It was something older and more dangerous, the possibility that wounds might heal, that stories might find their proper endings, that fathers and sons might speak across the chasm of years and find their voices still carried love. The messenger who had brought word of Abraham's death had been a young man from the household of Isaac, dust-covered and weary from the long journey south. His words had been simple: "The patriarch has breathed his last. He died full of years at peace. His sons are needed for the burial." Sons plural. Even in death, Abraham had not forgotten his firstborn, a child of promise who had lived outside the promise's fulfillment. As they drew nearer to Hebron, Ishmael found his thoughts drifting to the 3 times his father had visited him in the wilderness. Each visit had been wrapped in the protocol of secrecy. Abraham, arriving alone on his camel, never dismounting, honoring the oath he had sworn to Sarah before her death. The first visit had been a test, and Ishmael's wife at the time, a harsh woman whose heart held no room for hospitality, had failed it. Abraham had left a cryptic message about changing the threshold of the tent, and Ishmael had understood. The second visit, 3 years later, had been different. His new wife, gentle Fatima, had brought water and bread without being asked, had blessed the stranger's journey, had spoken words that rose like incense in the desert air. Abraham had blessed her in return, and when Ishmael returned from hunting, he found his tent filled with an abundance that spoke of divine favor restored. The third visit had come just before Sarah's death, and this time Abraham had dismounted from his camel. Father and son had embraced beneath the desert moon, and in that embrace, years of silence had been broken like bread shared between the hungry. They had spoken of many things of God's promises that seemed to contradict each other, of sons who carry their father's dreams and their father's sorrows, of the strange arithmetic of divine love that multiplies rather than divides. Abraham had wept that night, and his tears had fallen on desert sand that drank them like a blessing. Now, as Ishmael crested the final hill that overlooked the valley of Hebron, he saw them, the tents of mourning clustered around the family compound like white flowers blooming in the aftermath of storm. Smoke rose from the cooking fires, where the food of grief was being prepared. The sound of lamentation drifted up to him on the evening wind, voices raised in the ancient songs that escort the dead from the world of the living to the realm of memory and spirit. And there, standing beside the largest tent, was Isaac. Ishmael had expected this moment for days, had rehearsed in his mind the words he might speak, the gestures he might make. But the reality undid all his preparations. Isaac was no longer the small boy he remembered, the cherished child whose laughter had once filled their father's tent with such joy and such painful complexity. This Isaac was a man of 75, his hair gray as ash, his shoulders bearing the weight of responsibility and loss. Yet when their eyes met across the distance, Ishmael saw something that made his heart turn over in his chest. His father's eyes, deep and dark, and filled with a sorrow that reached back to the beginning of things. Isaac stepped forward, and Ishmael dismounted from his camel. They approached each other slowly, like 2 armies meeting under a flag of truce, neither sure what rituals of peace might be appropriate. When they were close enough to touch, they stopped. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, these 2 sons of Abraham, these inheritors of different promises, these brothers who had been shaped by the same love and divided by the same household's limitations. Ishmael, Isaac said, and the name on his lips carried neither accusation nor dismissal. It was simply recognition, the acknowledgement of a relationship that had survived everything that might have destroyed it. "Brother," Ishmael replied, using a word he had not spoken in decades. The word felt strange in his mouth, like water tasted after long thirst, both sweet and shocking. They embraced then, not with the easy affection of brothers who had never been parted, but with the careful tenderness of men who understood the fragility of reconciliation. Ishmael felt Isaac's tears on his shoulder and realized that his own cheeks were wet. Around them, the members of both households watched in silence, witnessing a healing that had been almost a century in the making. "He spoke of you," Isaac said when they finally stepped apart. "In his final days, he spoke of his firstborn son, the archer, the prince of the wilderness. He grieved that he had sent you away. He said it was the hardest thing God had ever asked of him." Ishmael nodded, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after the longest night. "I know," he said. "I have always known. The fault was not his. We were all caught in a story larger than ourselves, playing parts that were written before we drew breath." They buried Abraham 2 days later in the cave of Machpelah, that double chamber that Abraham had purchased from Ephron the Hittite as the first piece of the promised land to belong legally and permanently to his family. The cave lay at the heart of a field bordered by ancient trees, and Abraham had bought not just the cave, but the field and every tree within its boundaries, ensuring that his final resting place would be secure for all generations. Isaac and Ishmael carried their father's body together, their hands sharing the weight of the man who had given them life and set them on such different paths. Behind them walked their sons, the inheritors of different covenants, the founders of nations that would sometimes be allies and sometimes enemies, but who would always share the common heritage of Abraham's blood. At the mouth of the cave, they paused. Inside, Sarah already rested, the woman whose love had been fierce enough to reshape the world around her, whose jealousy had driven Ishmael into exile, whose death had made possible the reconciliation that now blessed this moment of burial. Ishmael felt no anger toward her memory. Time and distance had taught him that Sarah had acted from love for her son, and love, even possessive, fearful love, was better than indifference. As they lowered Abraham's body into the cave beside his beloved wife, both sons spoke the ancient words of commendation. "Gather him to his people," they said in unison. "Let him rest in peace." Above them, the sky was vast and blue, the same sky that had sheltered Abraham's wanderings, that had witnessed his conversations with angels, that had received his prayers for both his sons. When the burial was complete and the mourning rituals observed, Isaac and Ishmael sat together outside the cave as the sun set over the hills of Hebron. They spoke of their father's life, of the strange and wonderful promises that had shaped his destiny, of the children they had raised and the nations they would father. Ishmael's 12 sons had already begun to establish themselves as tribal leaders, their names destined to echo through history. Nebaioth and Kedar, Adbeel and Mibsam, Mishma and Duma and Massa, Hadid and Tema, Jeter and Naphish and Kedema, 12 princes, who had spread across the great peninsula to the south and established kingdoms in the wilderness. Isaac spoke of his own sons, the twins Jacob and Esau, born when he was 60, now 15 years old, and already showing the fierce independence that seemed to be the inheritance of Abraham's line. Jacob was the quiet one, the thinker, the one who dreamed of ladders reaching to heaven. Esau was the hunter, the man of the open country, whose hands were skilled with weapons, and whose heart was quick to love and quick to anger. "Perhaps," Isaac said as the first stars appeared, "our children will do better than we did. Perhaps they will find ways to honor both the promise and the blessing without forgetting that they are family." Ishmael nodded, though he suspected that the future would be more complicated than either of them could imagine. The seeds of both blessing and conflict had already been planted. His descendants would become great nations, masters of the desert ways, controllers of the trade routes that connected Africa and Asia and Europe. Isaac's descendants would inherit the land of promise, would become the people through whom all nations would be blessed. Sometimes their paths would cross in friendship. Sometimes they would clash like storm fronts, meeting over contested ground. But for now, in this moment of shared grief and unexpected grace, they were simply two brothers who had loved the same father and been shaped by the same mysteries. When Isaac offered to share his tent for the night, Ishmael accepted. When morning came, they broke their fast together, eating bread and honey and speaking of small things, the weather, the health of their flocks, the challenges of raising sons in a world that seemed always poised between promise and peril. Before Ishmael departed for his long journey back to Paran, Isaac gave him a gift, one of Abraham's ram's horns, the shofar that their father had used to call his household to prayer. So that when you sound it, Isaac said, you will remember that the God who heard you in the wilderness is the same God who called our father from Ur of the Chaldees, the same God who makes promises and keeps them, even when we cannot see how. Ishmael accepted the horn with hands that trembled slightly. It was more than a gift. It was an acknowledgement of his place in the family, his role in the unfolding story of Abraham's legacy. As he prepared to mount his camel, Isaac placed a hand on his shoulder. We are both sons of promise, Isaac said. Different promises, perhaps, but promises nonetheless. Let neither of us forget that. Ishmael nodded, and then he was riding away, his sons falling into formation behind him, the morning sun warm on their faces as they turned toward home. Behind them, the cave of Machpelah stood silent in its field of ancient trees, holding the bodies of the dead and the hopes of the living, a bridge between past and future, built of stone and tears and unexpected forgiveness. The road south stretched endless and familiar before them, leading back to the wilderness that had made them strong, back to the tribes and tents and challenges that awaited. But something had changed in these few days in Canaan. A weight had been lifted, a wound had begun to heal, a story had found not its ending, but its proper continuation. Ishmael knew that he would never again feel like the cast-off son, the child of second thoughts and desperate measures. He was the firstborn of Abraham, the one whose birth had brought laughter to an old man's tent, the prince of the wilderness, whose arrows flew true, and whose sons would rule nations yet unborn. As the sun climbed higher, and the heat of the day began to build, Ishmael touched the ram's horn hanging at his side and smiled. Tonight, when they made camp, he would sound it for the first time, calling his sons to prayer beneath the familiar stars. And in that call, echoing across the desert spaces, would be heard the voice of Abraham, the promises of God, and the continuing story of a family whose roots ran deep enough to survive any storm. Years flowed like sand through an hourglass in the wilderness of Paran, and with each passing season, Ishmael watched his sons transform from boys into men, from men into leaders, from leaders into the foundation stones of nations yet to be born. The ram's horn that Isaac had given him at their father's burial hung always at his side, and on clear nights when the desert wind carried no threat of storm, he would sound it across the dunes, a call that summoned not just his household to prayer, but seemed to echo with the voice of Abraham himself, reaching toward the stars that had witnessed the ancient promise. The 12 sons of Ishmael had grown into princes exactly as the angel had foretold. Nebaioth, the firstborn, possessed his father's skill with the bow, but combined it with a diplomat's tongue that could negotiate safe passage through the territories of hostile tribes. Kedar had inherited the restless spirit of the wilderness, becoming a master of the desert routes, his caravans carrying spices and precious goods from the southern kingdoms to the markets of Damascus and beyond. Each son bore within his name a destiny, and each destiny unfolded like a map of the future written in bloodlines and battle cries. Adbeel and Mibsam established themselves way to scrublands, and the caravans from Mesopotamia came to water their camels. Mishma and Duma claimed the rocky territories to the east, building fortified camps that could withstand both sandstorm and siege. Massa and Hadad ventured south, toward the incense routes that connected the kingdoms of Sheba and the spice merchants of the far Indies. Their names would echo through centuries, spoken with respect in the councils of kings and whispered with fear in the tents of their enemies. Tema and Jedder pushed toward the edges of settled lands, establishing trading posts that became cities, oases that became centers of power. Naphish and Kedema, the youngest, inherited the boldest portions of their father's spirit, leading raids against caravans that refused to pay tribute for safe passage, earning the reputation that would cling to all Ishmaelites, that they were men whose hands were quick to both trade and war. Yet for all their scattered dominions and diverse paths, they remained bound by the memory of the well where God had heard their father's dying cries, bound by the promise that had transformed exile into empire. When disputes arose between the tribes, they would send messengers to the tent of Ishmael, and the old archer would sit beneath the desert stars, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the sand as he spoke words of wisdom learned through 8 decades of survival. "Remember," he would tell them, "we are the children of promise, even if our promise wears different robes than our brother Isaac's. God told our mother that I would father 12 princes, and you are those princes. But a prince's strength is not measured only in the reach of his sword or the weight of his gold. It is measured in his ability to hear the voice that called us out of death in the wilderness." The territories they controlled stretched from Havilah in the south, where the gold mines glittered like fallen stars, to Shur in the north, where Egypt's borders shimmered in the heat haze. Their settlements became nodes in a vast network of trade and kinship that spanned the known world. Merchants from Ethiopia would arrive at their camps bearing ivory and ebony. Traders from India would bring silks and precious stones. Caravans from the north would carry silver and iron worked by the smiths of Damascus. But wealth brought challenges that mere survival had never posed. As the tribes grew powerful, they attracted the attention of the great empires, Egypt to the west, Assyria to the north, Babylon rising in the east. Kings and generals began to speak of the Ishmaelite Confederation as a force to be reckoned with, sometimes as allies to be courted, sometimes as enemies to be conquered. The sons of Ishmael learned to navigate the treacherous currents of international politics, forming alliances that would preserve their independence while enriching their treasuries. Ishmael lived to see his grandsons become warriors, and his great-grandsons become kings. He witnessed the fulfillment of every word the angel had spoken to his mother beside the well, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, that they would be strong enough to stand against any who opposed them, that they would dwell in the presence of all their kinsmen, yet maintain their fierce independence. When travelers brought news from the north, Ishmael would listen with the careful attention of one who understands that all stories are connected. He learned that his half-brother Isaac had married a woman named Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Arabian, and that, like their father Abraham, Isaac had waited long years for children. The parallel struck Ishmael as both poetic and prophetic. Perhaps God's timing followed patterns deeper than human understanding could fathom. Then came word that Rebekah had given birth to twins, and the details of their birth carried echoes that made Ishmael's blood quicken with recognition. The firstborn Esau had emerged red and hairy, a man of the wilderness and the hunt. The second, Jacob, had been born grasping his brother's heel, as if even in the womb he sought to claim what belonged to another. The oracle that Rebekah received during her difficult pregnancy, that 2 nations wrestled in her womb, that the elder would serve the younger, seemed to mirror the complex destiny that had marked Abraham's household from the beginning. As years passed, the stories that reached Paran grew more troubling. Esau had married women from among the local Canaanite tribes, causing grief to his parents, who remembered Abraham's strict command about maintaining the purity of the covenant line. Jacob had deceived his aging father to steal the blessing that belonged to Esau by right of birth. And now the brothers lived in bitter enmity that threatened to erupt into bloodshed. One evening, as Ishmael sat beside his fire, watching the flames dance against the darkness, a lone traveler approached his camp. The man was young, but carried himself with the wary caution of one who had learned that survival depended on reading the intentions of strangers quickly and accurately. When he spoke, his voice carried the accent of Canaan, and his eyes held the haunted look of the fugitive. "I seek the camp of Ishmael," the young man said. "I am Esau, son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham." Ishmael studied the young man's face and saw in it features that echoed his own, the high cheekbones that came from Abraham, the steady gaze that had marked their bloodline since the beginning of memory. Here was his nephew, the son of the brother with whom he had reconciled beside their father's grave, and the young man was clearly in some form of distress. "You are welcome at my fire, son of my brother," Ishmael said. "Come, eat, drink, and tell me what brings you so far from your father's tents." Esau accepted the hospitality with the gratitude of one who had been traveling hard and sleeping rough. As he ate, he told his story, how Jacob had purchased his birthright for a bowl of stew during a moment of hunger-driven weakness, how Jacob had later deceived Isaac to steal the blessing of the firstborn, how their mother Rebekah had helped orchestrate the deception to ensure that Jacob would inherit the covenant promises. Now Jacob has fled to Paddan Aram to find a wife among our kinsmen there, Esau said, his voice bitter with the accumulated grievances of years. "And I am left here, the eldest son who has been stripped of everything that should have been mine by right." Ishmael listened in silence, recognizing in Esau's story the same patterns of favoritism and deception that had marked his own childhood. But where Hagar had been driven away by Sarah's jealousy, here the conflict had taken a different form. The parents themselves had been divided, Isaac favoring Esau while Rebekah championed Jacob. "You have come seeking something," Ishmael observed. "What is it that you hope to find in the wilderness?" Esau's answer revealed both his pain and his pragmatic nature. He had learned that his parents disapproved of Canaanite wives, and he hoped that by marrying into Abraham's extended family, specifically into the line of Ishmael, he might win back some measure of their favor. Perhaps, he reasoned, if he could demonstrate his commitment to maintaining the family's covenant relationship with God, Isaac might yet find a way to restore some portion of his blessing. Ishmael considered the young man's request carefully. Marriage alliances were serious matters, especially when they involved the complex dynamics of covenant and promise that had shaped Abraham's legacy. After several days of conversation, during which Esau proved himself both respectful and capable, Ishmael agreed to the union. Esau married Mahalath, daughter of Ishmael, and through this marriage, the two branches of Abram's family were joined in a way that would have consequences reaching far into the future. Yet even as he blessed this union, Ishmael understood that Esau's troubles ran deeper than the question of marriage. The young man carried within himself a fundamental restlessness, a sense of having been displaced from his proper role in the unfolding story of God's promises. Ishmael recognized the feeling because he had carried it himself for many years. The knowledge that despite being Abraham's firstborn, despite being loved and blessed, he would never be the child through whom the great covenant would be fulfilled. "God's ways are not our ways," Ishmael told Esau as they walked together through the desert evening. "I spent years believing that I had been rejected, that Isaac's birth meant my own significance had been erased. But in time I came to understand that God's promises are large enough to encompass multiple destinies. Isaac's blessing does not diminish yours, just as yours does not diminish his." Esau nodded, but Ishmael could see that the young man's heart remained troubled. There was something in Esau's spirit that would never fully accept being second, never fully embrace the role of the elder brother who serves the younger. It was a wound that would pass to his descendants, creating generations of conflict between the children of Isaac and the children of Ishmael. As the seasons turned and Ishmael's years advanced, he began to feel the weight of his great age. He had lived 137 years, watching the world change around him, seeing kingdoms rise and fall, witnessing the slow but inexorable fulfillment of every promise God had made to Abraham's household. His sons had established themselves as the princes God had promised, their territories stretching across the vast expanses of Arabia, their influence felt from the borders of Egypt to the approaches of Mesopotamia. In his final years, Ishmael often returned in memory to that moment by the well, when the angel had appeared to his dying mother and revealed his name. God hears. Throughout all the decades of his life, through exile and reconciliation, through the establishment of his empire and the marriages of his sons, that truth had remained constant. God had heard his mother's cries in the wilderness. God had heard his own prayers as a young man learning to survive in an unforgiving land. God had heard the voices of his children as they grew into leaders of nations. When death finally came to Ishmael, it came gently, like sleep after a long day's journey. His 12 sons gathered around his tent, along with grandsons and great-grandsons whose numbers had already begun to fulfill the promise that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars. They buried him in the desert he had made his kingdom, and the mourning that rose from their camps could be heard across the vast distances of Arabia. But even as they mourned, the sons of Ishmael understood that their father's death marked not an ending, but a transition. The confederation he had built, the trading networks he had established, the military alliances he had forged, all of these would continue, growing stronger with each generation. They were no longer the exiled children of a slave woman. They were the princes of a nation, the inheritors of a promise, the keepers of a covenant that ran parallel to, but separate from the line that would flow through Isaac and Jacob. In years to come, the descendants of Ishmael would play crucial roles in the unfolding drama of biblical history. Ishmaelite traders would purchase a young man named Joseph from his jealous brothers and carry him down to Egypt, setting in motion the events that would lead to Israel's 400-year sojourn in the land of the Pharaohs. Ishmaelite warriors would battle against the armies of Israel when Joshua led the conquest of Canaan. Ishmaelite kings would form alliances with David and Solomon, bringing gold and spices to Jerusalem in acknowledgement of Israel's growing power. Yet through all these interactions, sometimes as allies, sometimes as adversaries, the children of Ishmael would remember the words their father had spoken around countless desert fires. We are all children of Abraham. We are all inheritors of promise. The covenant may wear different faces, but its source is the same. The ram's horn that Isaac had given Ishmael at Abraham's burial was passed down through the generations, sounded at moments of great celebration and great crisis, its voice carrying across the desert spaces the memory of reconciliation, the hope of peace, and the certainty that God's promises, once spoken, would never fail. In its echoing call could be heard the voice of Abraham, the tears of Hagar, the laughter of Isaac, and the fierce joy of Ishmael, all woven together into a song that would endure long after the desert winds had erased the footprints of their wandering. The story of the first family was far from over. It would continue through generations yet unborn, through conflicts yet to be fought, through reconciliations yet to be achieved. But in the life and death of Ishmael, the pattern had been established, that God's love is large enough to encompass multiple promises, that his covenant extends beyond the boundaries of any single nation or people, and that even in exile, even in the wilderness, even in the shadow of seemingly greater destinies, there is room for princes to arise and nations to be born. The desert wind carried whispers of change across the vast expanse of Paran on the day they buried Ishmael. His 12 sons stood in a circle around the grave they had carved into the hard earth, their faces weathered by decades of sun and struggle, their eyes reflecting the fierce independence that had marked their father's bloodline since the beginning of memory. Each prince bore the weight of leadership in his stance, the responsibility of nations yet unborn, resting upon shoulders that had learned early to carry more than a man's ordinary burden. Nebaioth, the eldest, spoke first, his voice carrying across the gathered tribes like the call of a hawk claiming its territory. "Our father has joined Abraham in the realm of the ancestors," he said, lifting the ram's horn that Isaac had given Ishmael so many years before. "But the sound of this horn will not be forgotten. We are the sons of promise, the inheritors of covenant, the children of the well where God heard our grandmother's cry." The horn's voice rose into the desert sky, long and mournful at first, and growing stronger, more defiant, until it seemed to carry within its echoing notes the memory of every word the angel had spoken beside that life. The tribes took up the call, voices joining in the ancient songs that had sustained them through generations of wandering, songs that spoke of stars too numerous to count, and descendants who would be as enduring as the desert itself. In the days that followed the burial, the confederation that Ishmael had built began to reveal its true strength. The 12 princes gathered in council beneath the same stars that had witnessed their grandfather, Abraham's first vision, and they spoke of the future with the pragmatic wisdom of men who understood that survival in the wilderness required both unity and the flexibility to adapt. They had inherited more than blood from their father. They had inherited a vision of what it meant to be free in a world where most men bowed to kings and pharaohs. Kedar rose from his place in the circle, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he outlined the territories that lay before them. "The trade routes from India to Egypt pass through our lands," he said, tracing patterns in the sand with his spear point. "The merchants from Babylon seek passage to the gold mines of Ophir. The caravans of the north carry silver and iron to the kingdoms of the south. We have become the guardians of the great crossroads, and in that guardianship lies both opportunity and responsibility." His words carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled, for the descendants of Ishmael had indeed become masters of the desert ways, their knowledge of hidden wells and safe passages making them indispensable to the commerce that bound the ancient world together. Their black goat-hair tents dotted the landscape from Havilah to Shur, marking territories that shifted with the seasons and the needs of their flocks, yet remained constant in their allegiance to the memory of the well where God had heard their forefathers' dying cries. Adbeel and Mibsam had established themselves as masters of the northern routes, their warriors riding swift camels that could cover distances in a single day that would take foot soldiers a week to traverse. They had learned the art of desert warfare from necessity, developing tactics that would confound the great armies of settled kingdoms for centuries to come. Strike swiftly, withdraw before the enemy could organize pursuit, appear where least expected, vanish like mirages when the heat grew too intense. These became the hallmarks of Ishmaelite military strategy. Mishma and Duma controlled the eastern approaches, where the vast emptiness of the desert provided both protection and challenge. Here, in lands where water was more precious than gold, they had become experts in the delicate art of negotiation, understanding that survival often depended more on words skillfully spoken than on weapons skillfully wielded. Their camps became neutral ground where enemies could meet to arrange truces, where disputes could be settled without bloodshed, where the ancient laws of hospitality provided sanctuary even to those who had come as foes. Massa and Hadad had pushed southward, toward the kingdoms where frankincense and myrrh grew in terraced gardens tended by men who had never known the freedom of the open desert. These princes became diplomats as well as warriors, learning the languages of settled peoples, mastering the intricate protocols of royal courts, yet never forgetting that their true loyalty lay with the confederation of tents that moved with the wind and the rain. As the seasons turned and the confederation grew in both strength and influence, the younger princes Tema and Jeter, Naphish and Kedema, began to fulfill the more troubling aspects of the prophecy that had been spoken over their forefather. "He will be a wild donkey of a man," the angel had told Hagar in the wilderness. "His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him." These words had seemed like curse, But the sons of Ishmael had learned to transform them into a source of strength. They became the lords of the wasteland, the princes of places where civilized men feared to travel. When caravans sought to cross their territories without paying tribute, swift riders would appear as if conjured from the heat shimmer, demanding payment for safe passage with voices that brooked no argument, and hands that rested casually on the hilts of curved swords. Those who paid found themselves under the protection of guides who knew every water source, every safe harbor, every path that avoided the territories of hostile tribes. Those who refused often found their bones bleaching in the sun, a warning to future travelers that the desert demanded respect. Yet they were not mere bandits, for their code of honor ran deeper than mere profit. A guest in their tent was sacred, protected even at the cost of their own lives. A treaty sworn by the ram's horn was inviolable, binding not only the generation that made it, but their children and their children's children. They understood that in the harsh mathematics of desert survival, reputation was as vital as water, and a name spoken with trust could open doors that gold alone could never breach. The Confederation's influence began to extend far beyond the boundaries of their traditional territories. In the great cities of the Nile Delta, merchants spoke of the Ishmaelite princes with a mixture of respect and wariness, knowing that these desert lords controlled the flow of luxury goods from the far south. In the ziggurats of Babylon, scribes recorded tribute payments to nomad chiefs whose power rested not on stone walls and standing armies, but on their ability to appear where least expected and strike where enemies felt most secure. Stories of their prowess spread like dust storms across the known world. They were the archers whose arrows never missed their mark, the raiders who could cross seemingly impossible distances in impossible time, the negotiators who could broker peace between kingdoms that had warred for generations. Their women were renowned for their beauty and their fierce independence, their children for their ability to survive in conditions that would kill the offspring of softer peoples. But it was their role as traders that perhaps most fully realized the promise God had made to Abraham about his son. The Ishmaelite caravans became legendary, great snaking lines of camels that carried the wealth of nations across distances that staggered the imagination. From the ports of the Red Sea, they brought coral and pearls. From the highlands of Ethiopia came gold and ivory. From the mysterious lands beyond the eastern horizon arrived silks and spices that commanded prices worthy of kings. These merchant princes learned to speak the languages of a dozen peoples, to navigate the complex web of alliances and enmities that characterized the ancient world, to read the subtle signs that marked the difference between profit and disaster in the unforgiving arithmetic of long-distance trade. They became walking libraries of practical knowledge, masters of the arts of survival, diplomacy, and commerce that would ensure their prosperity for generations to come. It was during this golden age of the Confederation that the most famous transaction in Ishmaelite history took place. The caravan was traveling northward from Gilead, its camels loaded with gum, balm, and myrrh, destined for the markets of Egypt, when the traders encountered a group of Hebrew brothers beside a pit in the wilderness near Dothan. What transpired there would bind the destinies of Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants in ways that none of the participants could have foreseen. The young man they purchased for 20 shekels of silver was named Joseph, and his story would become legend among both the children of Israel and the children of Ishmael. For the Ishmaelites, he represented everything they had become proof of their ability to recognize value where others saw only burden, evidence of their skill in the complex negotiations that turned human desperation into commercial opportunity. They treated him not as mere chattel, but as valuable cargo, understanding that his worth would increase rather than diminish if he arrived at his destination healthy and unharmed. The irony was not lost on the more thoughtful among the traders. They were carrying Abraham's great-grandson into Egypt, just as their own ancestor Hagar had carried Abraham's grandson into the wilderness. The wheel of providence was turning, weaving the scattered threads of the patriarch's legacy into a tapestry whose final pattern remained hidden from mortal eyes. When they sold Joseph to Potiphar in Egypt, the Ishmaelite merchants understood that they had played their part in some larger story. They had no way of knowing that the young Hebrew would rise to become second only to Pharaoh himself, or that his presence in Egypt would eventually draw his entire family southward, setting in motion the events that would lead to 4 centuries of bondage and a miraculous deliverance that would echo through history. They knew only that they had done what Ishmaelites did best. They had moved goods and people across vast distances. They had turned opportunity into profit, and they had ensured their own survival in a world that showed little mercy to the weak or the unprepared. The decades that followed saw the Confederation continue to grow in power and influence. The sons of the 12 princes established their own territories, creating a network of alliances that stretched across the known world. Some became kings in their own right, ruling over oasis cities that served as vital waypoints for desert travelers. Others remained true to the nomadic tradition, leading their people in endless migrations that followed the ancient rhythms of rain and drought, abundance and scarcity. Yet through all their wanderings and all their transformations, they carried within them the memory of their origins. In their tents, they kept copies of the genealogies that traced their lineage back to Abraham, preserving in oral tradition the stories of Hagar's flight into the wilderness, of the angel's promise beside the well, of Ishmael's reconciliation with Isaac at their father's burial. These stories were more than mere history. They were the foundation of identity, the wellspring of the fierce pride that sustained them through the hardships of desert life. They remembered, too, the words that God had spoken about their ancestor, that he would father 12 princes, that his descendants would be numerous as the stars, that they would dwell in the presence of all their brethren. Looking around at their expanding territories, their growing influence, their increasing prosperity, they could see these promises being fulfilled in ways that exceeded even the boldest dreams of their forefathers. As the sun set over the vast expanse of Paran on the anniversary of Ishmael's death, Nebaioth climbed the same hill where his father had so often stood to survey his domain. In his hands he held the ram's horn that Isaac had given as a token of reconciliation, and as he lifted it to his lips, its voice carried across the desert spaces where the black tents of his people dotted the landscape like stars fallen to earth. The sound reached the ears of shepherds tending their flocks by night, of warriors keeping watch at the edges of hostile territory, of merchants preparing for journeys that would take them to the ends of the known world. In that echoing call, they heard the voice of their history, the promise of their future, and the enduring certainty that they were children of covenant, inheritors of blessing, the fulfillment of words spoken beside a well in the wilderness where God had heard the cry of the oppressed and had answered with the gift of nations yet unborn. The voice of the ram's horn echoed across the vast expanses of Arabia long after Nebaioth's breath had ceased to fill it, carried not by wind alone, but by the inexorable current of history itself. In the generations that followed the death of Ishmael, the 12 princes did indeed become what the angel had promised beside the dying well-rulers of nations, masters of territories so vast that no single map could contain their dominion, inheritors of a covenant that ran parallel to, but separate from the promises made to Isaac's line. Yet their story was not one of mere expansion and conquest. It was a tapestry woven with threads of prophecy and providence, conflict and reconciliation, exile and return. The descendants of Ishmael had become more than nomads wandering the desert spaces. They had become the living fulfillment of words spoken by divine messengers, the walking verification of promises that even the angels had questioned when they saw the boy dying beneath the desert bush. The confederation that Nebaioth and his brothers had built stretched from the borders of Egypt to the gates of Mesopotamia, from the Red Sea's coral shores to the fertile valleys of the Jordan. Their black goat hair tents dotted the landscape like stars fallen to earth, each one a point of light in the gathering darkness of a world where empires rose and fell with the regularity of desert storms. But it was in their encounters with their kinsmen, the descendants of Abraham through other lines, that the deeper the brothers of Joseph stood beside that pit near Dothan. Looking down at their father's favored son, they could not have known that the Ishmaelite caravan approaching from Gilead carried within its train the threads of a story that would reshape the destiny of nations. The merchants who purchased Joseph for 20 shekels of silver were not mere traders seeking profit in the slave markets of Egypt. They were the instruments of a providence that worked through the ordinary transactions of human commerce to accomplish extraordinary purposes. These sons of Ishmael, carrying spices and balm and myrrh along the ancient routes their forefathers had established, became the unlikely shepherds of Jacob's beloved son, guiding him toward a destiny that would preserve not only his own family, but the entire house of Abraham through 7 years of famine. The irony was not lost on those who understood the deeper currents of the story. Ishmael, the son who had been sent away to preserve Isaac's inheritance, had become through his descendants the instrument of Isaac's grandson's preservation. The child of exile had become the agent of rescue, proving that God's mercy extended far beyond the boundaries of any single covenant or promise. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the generations, sometimes with the Ishmaelites serving as allies, sometimes as adversaries, but always as participants in the larger drama of redemption that was unfolding across the stage of history. When Moses fled from Egypt after killing the Egyptian taskmaster, it was among the Midianites' kinsmen of the Ishmaelites, through their common descent from Abraham, that he found refuge, a wife, and the revelation of the burning bush. The relationship between the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael was never simple, never reducible to the categories of friend or enemy that marked the interactions between most ancient peoples. They were bound by blood and covenant, by shared ancestry and competing promises, by the memory of reconciliation and the reality of ongoing tension. When Gideon faced the vast army of Midianites and Amalekites and other eastern peoples, the text specifically notes that they wore golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites, detail that suggests not mere ornamentation, but a cultural marker that distinguished them from the settled peoples around them. The defeat of these armies by Gideon's 300 men was more than a military victory. It was a theological statement about the source of Israel's strength. Yet even in defeat, the Ishmaelites maintained their identity, their pride, their conviction that they too were children of promise, inheritors of blessing, recipients of divine favor. The golden earrings that Gideon collected as tribute were not just spoils of war, but symbols of a people who understood themselves to be princes in their own right, rulers of territories that stretched beyond the reach of any settled kingdom. As the centuries passed, the territories controlled by the descendants of Ishmael became increasingly important to the great empires that dominated the ancient Near East. The Assyrian records speak of campaigns against the Sunwil-Yu, the Ishmaelites, describing them sometimes as allies to be courted, sometimes as enemies to be subdued, but always as a force to be reckoned with. The tribute lists carved into stone monuments record payments of silver and gold, of camels and horses, of frankincense and myrrh, flowing from the oasis cities and desert strongholds of Arabia into the treasuries of Nineveh and Babylon. Yet the Ishmaelites were never merely subjects of greater powers. They maintained their independence through a combination of military prowess, diplomatic skill, and intimate knowledge of territories that no foreign army could hope to master. When Assyrian kings boasted of conquering from Havilah to Shur, they were acknowledging the extent of Ishmaelite territory, while simultaneously revealing their own limitations. They could raid and extract tribute, but they could not rule the desert as those who had been born to its harsh freedoms. A greatest testimony to the enduring significance of the Ishmaelite princes came not from the records of their enemies, but from the prophecies of their kinsmen. When Isaiah spoke of the future glory of Jerusalem, he specifically mentioned that all the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you, the rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. Here was a vision that transcended the temporary conflicts and shifting alliances of political history, a promise that the descendants of Ishmael would one day bring their wealth and their worship to the temple of the God who had heard their ancestors cry in the wilderness. The prophecy was remarkable, not just for its scope, but for its theological implications. It suggested that the covenant with Abraham was indeed large enough to encompass all his descendants, that the promises made to Isaac did not negate the blessings spoken over Ishmael, that the God who had chosen one line for a special purpose had not forgotten or abandoned the others. In the age to come, the prophet declared, the children of promise and the children of exile would worship together, their offerings ascending from the same altar, their voices joining in the same songs of praise. This vision of ultimate reconciliation did not ignore the realities of ongoing conflict. The same prophetic literature that spoke of Kedar's flocks gathering to Jerusalem also contained warnings about the burden of Arabia, predictions of judgment and warfare that would sweep across the desert kingdoms. The descendants of Ishmael, like all the peoples of the earth, would face the consequences of their choices, the judgment that comes to all who turn away from the purposes of God. Yet even these prophecies of judgment contained within them the promise of restoration. The God who had promised to make Ishmael a great nation would not allow that nation to be utterly destroyed, no matter how far it might wander from the path of righteousness. The covenant made beside the well in the wilderness was as enduring as the covenant made with Isaac, as permanent as the stars that Abraham had counted in the night sky when God first called him to leave Ur of the Chaldees. As the biblical period drew toward its close and the ancient world gave way to new configurations of power and faith, the descendants of Ishmael found themselves at the center of developments that would reshape the spiritual landscape of humanity. The Arabian Peninsula, which had been their stronghold for millennia, became the birthplace of new movements of faith and devotion, new understandings of the relationship between God and humanity, new expressions of the ancient longing for connection with the divine. The cities that the sons of Ishmael had built as waypoints for their caravans became centers of learning and pilgrimage. Mecca, which some traditions claimed had been founded by the descendants of Nebaioth himself, grew from a desert oasis into a focal point of spiritual aspiration for millions of people. The wells that their ancestors had dug in their wanderings became places of blessing and renewal, visited by seekers who came from the ends of the earth to drink from waters that remembered the angel's promise and the mother's tears. In these developments, those who studied the patterns of providence could see the working out of purposes that had been set in motion centuries earlier beside a well in the wilderness of Beersheba. The promise that Ishmael would become a great nation had been fulfilled not just in terms of political power or economic influence, but in the deeper realm of spiritual significance. His descendants had become custodians of sacred places, guardians of ancient wisdom, keepers of traditions that connected the present age to the earliest chapters of human encounter with the divine. The ram's horn that had passed from Isaac to Ishmael at Abraham's burial, that had been sounded by Nebaioth and his brothers as they established their dominion over the desert spaces, continued to echo in the prayers and practices of their descendants. Its voice carried across the centuries, calling people to remember that the God who hears is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that the promises made to the patriarchs endure through every generation, that the covenant established with Abraham extends its blessings to all who call upon the name of the Lord. In the great tapestry of biblical history, the story of Ishmael and his descendants serves as a golden thread, weaving through the accounts of kings and prophets, of exile and return, of judgment and mercy. It reminds us that God's purposes are larger than any single nation or people, that his covenant love extends to all the children of Abraham, that even those who seem to be sent away are never truly forgotten or abandoned. The well in the wilderness still gives water to those who are dying of thirst. The angel's promise still echoes in the desert wind. And the descendants of the boy who was saved by divine intervention continue to play their role in the unfolding drama of redemption, witnesses to the truth that God indeed hears the cry of the afflicted and answers with the gift of life itself. The centuries rolled forward like desert winds across the great Arabian Peninsula, carrying with them the echoes of ancient promises and the ongoing fulfillment of words spoken beside a well in the wilderness of Beersheba. The confederation that the 12 sons of Ishmael had built endured through the rise and fall of empires, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the fierce independence that had marked their bloodline since the days when their ancestor had learned to survive in the harsh embrace of Paran. When the United Kingdom of Israel reached its golden zenith under Solomon, the descendants of Ishmael found themselves once again playing a crucial role in the grand theater of biblical history. The trade routes they controlled had become the arteries through which the wealth of nations flowed, and Solomon's legendary prosperity depended largely on the stability and cooperation of the Arabian princes who commanded these vital passages. The palace scribes in Jerusalem recorded with careful precision the tribute that arrived each year from the kings of Arabia, 666 talents of gold, not counting the precious stones, spices, and exotic goods that accompanied the diplomatic envoys. These were not mere payments extracted by force, but the fruits of partnerships carefully cultivated over generations. Agreements sealed not just with gold, but with the ancient bonds of kinship that linked the house of Solomon to the descendants Isaac and Ishmael. The Queen of Sheba's famous journey to Jerusalem was but one episode in a much larger story of interaction between the Israelite kingdom and the princes of the south. Her caravan, laden with spices and gold and precious stones, traveled along routes secured by Ishmaelite warriors and guided by men who had inherited from their forefathers the knowledge of every well, every safe harbor, every hidden path through the seemingly trackless wastes. The sons of Kedar had become masters of the northern approaches, their black-haired tents dotting the landscape from Damascus to the borders of Egypt. Their flocks were beyond numbering sheep, whose wool was prized in the markets of Tyre, goats whose milk sustained entire communities, camels whose endurance made possible the great trading expeditions that connected the shores of the Mediterranean with the courts of distant kingdoms. When Isaiah prophesied of a future glory, he spoke of these very flocks. All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. The children of Nebaioth, meanwhile, had established themselves as the premier diplomatic intermediaries of the region, their skill in negotiation matched only by their reputation for keeping faith with all who dealt honorably with them. In the great centers of learning that grew up around the oasis cities they controlled, scholars preserved not only the practical knowledge needed for survival in the desert, but also the stories that connected them to their origins, the tale of Hagar's flight, the angel's promise, the well that gave water in the wilderness, the reconciliation between Isaac and Ishmael at Abraham's tomb. Yet the very success of the Ishmaelite confederation brought with it new challenges and responsibilities. As the great empires of the ancient world, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, rose to unprecedented heights of power and ambition, the descendants of Ishmael found themselves courted as allies, threatened as obstacles, and sometimes attacked as enemies by forces that viewed their independence as an affront to imperial authority. The Assyrian records speak of campaigns against the Sumu, the Ishmaelites, describing them as a confederation of tribes whose military prowess and intimate knowledge of desert warfare made them formidable opponents even for the world's most powerful armies. When Assyrian kings boasted of receiving tribute from all the kings of Arabia, they were acknowledging both the wealth of the Ishmaelite territories and the wisdom of those who chose diplomatic accommodation over feudal resistance. But the relationship between the great empires and the desert princes was never simple. The same independence that made the Ishmaelites valuable allies also made them unreliable subjects. When imperial demands became excessive, when the terms of cooperation threatened their freedom to move with the seasons and the needs of their flocks, the sons of the desert could vanish like mirages, striking where they were not expected, appearing where they could not be caught, demonstrating again and again that the prophecy spoken over their ancestor remained alive in their blood. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand would be against him. The prophets of Israel understood this pattern, recognizing in the Ishmaelites both kinsmen to be honored and symbols of the restless human spirit that refuses to be contained by the boundaries others would impose. When Jeremiah spoke of the cup of God's wrath being passed among the nations, he specifically mentioned all the kings of Arabia who live in the desert, acknowledging that even the children of promise were not exempt from divine judgment when they turned away from the purposes of the Almighty. Yet even these prophecies of judgment contained within them the promise of restoration. The God who had sworn to make Ishmael a great nation would not allow that nation to be utterly destroyed, no matter how far it might wander from the path of righteousness. The covenant made beside the well in the wilderness was as enduring as the covenant made with Isaac, as permanent as the stars that Abraham had counted in the night sky when God first called him to leave his homeland and venture into the unknown. As the centuries passed and the political landscape of the ancient Near East shifted like sand dunes reshaped by desert storms, the role of the Ishmaelites in the ongoing drama of biblical history continued to evolve. When the Babylonians swept away the Assyrian Empire and established their own dominion over the known world, the descendants of Ishmael adapted once again, forming new alliances, negotiating fresh agreements, maintaining their essential independence while acknowledging the realities of imperial power. The Persian conquest of Babylon brought yet another transformation to the political order, but it also opened new opportunities for those who had learned to thrive in times of change. The Persian policy of tolerating and even encouraging local customs and religious practices created an environment in which the various peoples of the former Babylonian Empire could reassert their identities while remaining within the larger framework of Persian rule. It was during this Persian period that one of the most significant encounters between the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael took place, not on a battlefield or in a royal court, but in the everyday drama of reconstruction and resistance that marked the return of the Jewish exiles to their homeland. When Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, with authorization from King Artaxerxes to rebuild the walls of the Holy City, he found himself facing opposition from a coalition of local leaders who viewed the restoration of Jewish autonomy as a threat to their own power and influence. Among these opponents was a man named Geshem, identified in the biblical text as the Arab, whose very presence in this story testifies to the continuing significance of the Ishmaelite bloodline in the affairs of the region. Geshem was no minor tribal chieftain, but a powerful ruler whose authority extended across vast territories, possibly the same man identified in contemporary inscriptions as Gashmu, king of Kedar. His involvement in the opposition to Nehemiah's mission reveals how deeply the descendants of Ishmael had become integrated into the political structures of the Persian Empire while maintaining their distinct identity and interests. The conflict between Nehemiah and Geshem was more than a dispute over building permits or territorial boundaries. It represented a collision between two different visions of what it meant to be a child of Abraham, two different understandings of how the ancient promises should be fulfilled in the present age. Nehemiah represented the returning exiles, the people who believed that God's covenant with Abraham would be fulfilled through the restoration of Israel in the promised land. Geshem represented the descendants who had never left, who had built their own kingdoms and established their own relationship with the divine, who saw no reason why their cousin's return should disturb the balance of power they had worked for generations to establish. The exchanges between these two men, recorded in the book of Nehemiah, reveal the complexity of family relationships when they are played out on the stage of international politics. When Geshem and his allies accused Nehemiah of planning rebellion against the Persian king, they were employing a political strategy that had served them well in previous encounters with imperial authority. When Nehemiah responded with appeals to the God of heaven and reminders of ancient promises, He was drawing on resources that had sustained his people through centuries of exile and oppression. In the end, neither man completely achieved his objectives. Nehemiah succeeded in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, but the tensions between the returning exiles and their neighbors remained unresolved. Geshem maintained his position as a regional power broker, but he could not prevent the reestablishment of a Jewish presence in Jerusalem that would eventually challenge the dominance of the surrounding peoples. The encounter between Nehemiah and Geshem serves as a microcosm of the larger relationship between the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael throughout the biblical period. It was a relationship marked by both kinship and rivalry, by moments of cooperation and periods of conflict, by the recognition of shared ancestry and the assertion of competing claims to divine favor. Neither could ignore the other. Neither could completely overcome the other. Both were bound together by bonds stronger than politics or economics, the bonds of blood and covenant that stretched back to a tent in Canaan, where an old man had grieved over the necessity of sending away his firstborn son. As the Persian period gave way to the Hellenistic age and Greek culture began to penetrate even the remotest corners of the Arabian Peninsula, the descendants of Ishmael faced new challenges to their traditional way of life. The armies of Alexander the Great conquered territories that had been independent for millennia, imposing new forms of government and new ways of thinking about the relationship between rulers and subjects. Yet even Alexander's seemingly irresistible advance was checked by the vastness of the Arabian deserts and the skill of those who had learned to use that vastness as both shield and sword. The Nabateans, whom many scholars identify with the descendants of Nebaioth, demonstrated how the ancient Ishmaelite gifts for trade and diplomacy could be adapted to meet the challenges of a new era. Their capital at Petra became one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, a city carved from living rock that served as both fortress and marketplace, a symbol of how the children of the desert could create beauty and order without abandoning their essential freedom. The trade routes they controlled became more valuable than ever as the Hellenistic kingdoms competed for access to the luxuries of India and the Far East. Frankincense and myrrh, silk and spices, precious stones and exotic animals all flowed through territories controlled by descendants of Ishmael, generating wealth that rivaled that of the great cities of the Mediterranean world. Yet wealth and success brought their own temptations. As the Ishmaelite princes grew accustomed to the comforts of settled life, as their children learned Greek philosophy alongside the traditional lore of the desert, as their courts became centers of international diplomacy and cultural exchange, some began to question whether the old ways of their ancestors were still relevant in a rapidly changing world. It was during this period of questioning and transition that the prophetic voices of Israel spoke their most powerful words about the ultimate destiny of Ishmael's children. Isaiah's vision of the flocks of Kedar and the rams of Nebaioth being gathered to Jerusalem was more than a prediction of political alliance or economic cooperation. It was a promise that the God who had heard Hagar's cry in the wilderness would ultimately gather all of Abraham's children into the fullness of his covenant, that the divisions created by human fear and jealousy would one day be healed by divine love. The voice that had spoken to Hagar beside the well, the voice that had called Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees, the voice that had wrestled with Jacob through the long night and blessed him with a new name, this same voice continued to speak through the prophets of Israel, declaring that the promises made to all of Abraham's descendants would be fulfilled in ways that transcended human understanding and exceeded human expectations. As the sun set over the vast Arabian Peninsula on the last day of another turning year, the descendants of Ishmael could look back on centuries of fulfillment and forward to mysteries yet to be revealed. They had indeed become a great nation, exactly as the angel had promised. They had been fruitful and multiplied exceedingly, exactly as God had sworn to Abraham. They had dwelt in the presence of all their brethren, sometimes as allies, sometimes as adversaries, but always as participants in the grand drama of redemption that was unfolding across the stage of history. The ram's horn that had passed from Isaac to Ishmael at Abraham's burial still sounded across the desert spaces, its voice carrying the memory of reconciliation and the hope of greater reconciliations yet to come. In that echoing call could be heard the promise that the God who hears would never stop listening, that the covenant established beside a well in the wilderness would endure until the day when all of Abraham's children would gather around the same altar, their offerings ascending together like incense before the throne of the Most High. The centuries rolled forward like waves upon a distant shore, carrying with them the echoes of ancient promises and the slow, inexorable unfolding of destinies written in the stars above Abraham's tent. The confederation that the sons of Ishmael had built endured through the rise and fall of the great empires Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, adapting to each new configuration of power while maintaining the essential independence that had marked their bloodline since the days when their ancestor had learned to draw water from hidden wells in the harsh embrace of Paran. When Alexander the Great swept across the known world like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path, his armies broke against the vastness of the Arabian deserts, like waves against an immovable cliff. The descendants of Ishmael had learned too well the lessons of the wilderness to be conquered by any force that depended on supply lines and settled bases. They could vanish into the heat shimmer of noon and reappear at dawn 100 miles away, striking where they were least expected, withdrawing before retaliation could be organized. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's shattered empire found themselves dealing not with subjects to be governed, but with partners to be negotiated with. The trade routes that the Ishmaelites controlled had become more valuable than ever, as the appetite of the Mediterranean world for Eastern luxuries grew beyond all previous bounds. Silk from China, spices from India, frankincense and myrrh from the hidden valleys of southern Arabia all flowed through territories where the black goat-hair tents of Ishmael's children marked the only safe harbors in an ocean of sand. Among these descendants, none proved more adapted descent from Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael's 12 sons. These people, whom the Greeks called Nabateans, had transformed themselves from nomadic herders into the master architects of a desert civilization that astounded all who encountered it. Their capital at Petra, carved from living rock in the heart of the wilderness, stood as a testament to the truth that the children of exile could create beauty and wonder that rivaled anything built by kings who had never known the sting of rejection. Petra was more than a city. It was a statement written in stone, a declaration that the promises made beside a well in the wilderness of Beersheba had been fulfilled in ways that exceeded even the boldest dreams of those who first heard them. The rose-red facades that emerged from the canyon walls seemed to glow with their own inner light, as if the very stones remembered the angel's words to Hagar. I will make him a great nation. The Nabatean engineers had solved the fundamental riddle of desert survival, developing systems of water collection and storage that allowed them to thrive in lands where other peoples could barely exist. Their mastery of the monsoon cycles, their understanding of the hidden geometry of rainfall and evaporation, their ability to channel and preserve the precious gift of water all. These skills testified to generations of careful observation, patient experimentation, and the kind of wisdom that can be learned only through intimate communion with the harsh truths of the wilderness. Yet their greatest achievement was not architectural, but commercial. The Nabateans had become the indispensable intermediaries of international trade, their caravans linking the great civilizations of the ancient world in networks of exchange that brought prosperity to all who participated honestly in them. When Roman merchants in Damascus bought frankincense for the temples of Jupiter, when Egyptian priests purchased myrrh for the mummification of pharaohs, when Greek philosophers acquired rare spices for their mysterious rituals, the gold they paid flowed eventually into the treasuries of descendants of Ishmael. The Romans, those methodical builders of empire who had conquered most of the known world through superior organization and relentless discipline, found themselves confronting in the Arabian Peninsula a challenge unlike any they had previously faced. Here were peoples who could not be defeated through conventional military means, who could not be governed through standard imperial administration, who could not be understood through the usual categories of civilization and barbarity. When Pompey's legions tried to impose Roman authority on the Nabatean kingdom, they discovered that victories in the field meant little when the enemy could simply disappear into trackless wastes where Roman supply trains could not follow. When Augustus attempted to conquer Arabia Felix through the expedition of ISHMAEL'S, his forces found themselves lost in deserts where their Arabian guides led them in circles until disease and exhaustion accomplished what no army had been able to achieve, the complete defeat of seemingly invincible Roman power. In the end, the Romans learned what every previous empire had discovered. The descendants of Ishmael could be partners, but they could not be subjects. The tribute that eventually flowed from Arabian kingdoms to Roman treasuries was paid not as submission, but as the price of cooperation, acknowledgement that the sons of the desert controlled resources too valuable to be ignored and territories too vast to be conquered. It was during this period of Roman dominance that the most extraordinary fulfillment of ancient prophecy took place, though few who witnessed it at the time understood its full significance. In the small town of Bethlehem, not far from the wells where Abraham had once negotiated water rights with the local inhabitants, a child was born who would transform their relationship between heaven and earth in ways that even the prophets had struggled to comprehend. The birth itself was unremarkable. A young woman in labor, a crowded inn, a stable that offered shelter when no other accommodation could be found. But the child who drew his first breath in that humble setting carried within his veins the fulfillment of promises that reached back to the beginning of human history. Promises that encompassed not only the descendants of Isaac, but also the children of Ishmael, who had waited so long for their own portion of divine blessing. Word of the birth traveled along the trade routes, as all significant news did in those days, carried by merchants and pilgrims, by caravan guards and diplomatic messengers, spreading across the vast networks that connected Damascus to Delhi, Alexandria to Babylon. Among those who heard the whispered reports were men of learning and wisdom, scholars who had spent their lives studying the movements of the stars and the patterns of divine intervention in human affairs. These men, whom the gospel writers would call magi, the wise men from the East, represented the flowering of centuries of Ishmaelite wisdom and prosperity. They were the inheritors of the astronomical knowledge that desert peoples had necessarily developed, the keepers of the navigational secrets that made possible the great trading expeditions, the masters of the diplomatic arts that had enabled their ancestors to maintain independence through the rise and fall of empires. But they were more than merely scholars or astrologers. They were the living fulfillment of prophecies spoken by Isaiah when he envisioned a time when a multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord. In their journey to Bethlehem, carrying gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, they enacted on a small scale what the prophets had seen in vision, the gathering of the nations to worship the true King. Their arrival at the stable where the child lay sleeping with his mother was charged with significance that transcended the apparently simple transaction of gift-giving. Here were representatives of Ishmael's bloodline, descendants of the son who had been sent away to preserve Isaac's inheritance, coming to honor Isaac's ultimate descendant with the wealth that their own exile had enabled them to accumulate. The irony was as beautiful as it was profound. The child of promise was being welcomed by the children of exile. The heir of the covenant was receiving tribute from those who had been excluded from its primary benefits. The gold they offered spoke of earthly kingship, the recognition that this child would rule over kingdoms and nations in ways that transcended the ordinary dynamics of political power. The frankincense proclaimed his divinity. acknowledging that in this infant the eternal God had taken human form, bridging the chasm that had separated heaven and earth since the first rebellion in Eden. The myrrh, that bitter spice used in preparing bodies for burial, pointed toward the ultimate sacrifice that would reconcile all the scattered children of Abraham, both those who had remained in the land of promise and those who had made their homes in the wilderness of exile. When the wise men departed, returning to their eastern territories by routes that avoided the paranoid suspicions of King Herod, they carried with them more than memories of a remarkable journey. They had witnessed the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing story of divine redemption, a chapter that would ultimately encompass not only the descendants of Isaac, but also the children of Ishmael, not only the people of the covenant, but also the nations that had been excluded from its immediate benefits. The decades and centuries that followed saw the gradual fulfillment of the larger vision that the Magi's journey had prefigured. As the message of the child born in Bethlehem spread across the Roman Empire and beyond, it reached communities of Arabian merchants and Nabatean traders, desert dwellers and oasis settlers, all the scattered children of Ishmael who had maintained their identity through generations of wandering and settlement. Some embraced the new teaching eagerly, recognizing in it the fulfillment of longings that their own traditions had kept alive. Others resisted, feeling that their ancestral ways were sufficient for their spiritual needs. Still others waited, sensing that the full revelation of God's purposes had not yet been completed, that there were further chapters to be written in a long story of divine mercy and human response. But the prophets had seen further than the immediate aftermath of the Messiah's first coming. Isaiah's vision encompassed not only the gifts brought by wise men from the east, but also a time when all the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered together unto thee. The rams of Nebaioth shall minister unto thee. They shall come up with acceptance on mine altar, and I will glorify the house of my glory. This was a promise that reached beyond the boundaries of any single generation, a vision of ultimate reconciliation that would be fulfilled only when the Messiah returned to establish his kingdom on earth. In that future day, the prophets declared, the divisions that had marked the family of Abraham from the time of Isaac's birth would finally be healed. The descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael would worship together in Jerusalem, their offerings ascending from the same altar, their voices joining in the same songs of praise. The children of covenant and the children of exile would discover that they had always been part of the same story, participants in the same divine drama of redemption and restoration. The promise was as audacious as it was beautiful, that the God who had heard Hagar's cry in the wilderness would ultimately gather all her descendants into the fullness of his blessing, that the well where the angel had provided water in the desert would become a fountain flowing with the grace that encompasses all nations, all peoples, all the scattered children of the earth. As the sun set over the vast Arabian Peninsula on the last day of another turning year, the descendants of Ishmael could look back on centuries of fulfillment and forward to promises yet to be realized. They had indeed become a great nation, exactly as the angel had foretold. They had been fruitful and multiplied exceedingly, exactly as God had sworn to Abraham. They had dwelt in the presence of all their brethren, sometimes as allies, sometimes as adversaries, but always as participants in the grand drama of redemption that was unfolding across the stage of history. The ram's horn that had passed from Isaac to Ishmael at Abraham's burial still sounded across the desert spaces, its voice carrying the memory of reconciliation and the hope of greater reconciliations yet to come. In that echoing call could be heard the promise that the God who hears would never stop listening, that the covenant established beside a well in the wilderness would endure until the day when all of Abraham's children would gather around the same altar, their offerings ascending together like incense before the throne of the Most High. The story of the first family was far from over. It would continue through generations yet unborn, through conflicts yet to be fought, through reconciliations yet to be achieved. But in the life and legacy of Ishmael, the pattern had been established. that God's love is large enough to encompass multiple promises, that his covenant extends beyond the boundaries of any single nation or people, and that even in exile, even in the wilderness, even in the shadow of seemingly greater destinies, there is room for princes to arise and nations to be born. The voice that had spoken to Hagar beside the well, the voice that had called Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees, the voice that had wrestled with Jacob through the long night and blessed him with a new name, this same voice continued to speak through the prophets and the wise men, through the merchants and the kings, through all who recognized that the promises of God are as vast as the desert sky and as enduring as the stars that Abraham had counted in the night when hope first dawned in his heart. In the end, the story of Ishmael was not a tale of rejection, but of inclusion, not a narrative of exclusion, but of expansion, not the chronicle of a promise denied, but of a covenant that proved large enough to encompass all the children of faith, all the seekers after truth, all who would hear the voice that calls across the wilderness and respond with hearts open to the infinite possibilities of divine grace. The desert wind that had carried the echo of the ram's horn across countless generations grew gentler as the years accumulated like sand in an hourglass, marking the passage of time toward the inevitable conclusion of mortal stories. Ishmael had lived to see the fulfillment of every promise spoken. Beside that well in the wilderness where his mother had wept and an angel had proclaimed his destiny. 137 years had passed since his first breath had drawn the harsh air of Paran into his lungs. And now, as the desert stars wheeled in their ancient patterns above his tent, he prepared to join the great assembly of those who had gone before. His 12 sons gathered around his bedside, their faces weathered by decades of desert sun, their eyes reflecting the fierce independence that had marked their bloodline since the beginning of memory. Nebaioth, the eldest, held the ram's horn that Isaac had given their father so many years before at Abraham's burial, that same horn whose voice had called the confederation together in times of celebration and crisis, whose echoing notes had carried across the vast Arabian Peninsula the memory of reconciliation and the promise of greater reconciliations yet to come. Each prince bore in his weathered features the mark of fulfilled prophecy. They had indeed become rulers of nations, exactly as the angel had foretold beside the dying well. Their territories stretched from Havilah in the south, where frankincense trees released their precious resin in terraced gardens tended by men, whose trade routes converged like rivers flowing toward the sea. Their black goat-hair tents dotted the landscape as far as the eye could see, marking settlements that had grown from nomadic camps into thriving centers of commerce and culture. Kedar had established himself as the master of the northern approaches, his warriors mounted on swift camels that could traverse in a single-day distances that would take foot soldiers a week to cover. His name had become synonymous with excellence in archery, his people renowned throughout the known world for their skill with the bow and their intimate knowledge of the desert's hidden paths. When merchants spoke of safe passage through hostile territory, when kings planned expeditions to distant lands, when generals sought guides who could lead armies through seemingly impassable wastes, they spoke of Kedar's sons with a respect reserved for those who had mastered arts that meant the difference between life and death. Nebaioth had fulfilled his destiny as the premier diplomat of the Confederation, his skill in negotiation matched only by his reputation for keeping faith with all who dealt honorably with him. The oasis cities under his protection had become neutral ground where enemies could meet to arrange truces, where disputes could be settled without bloodshed, where the ancient laws of hospitality provided sanctuary even to those who had come as foes. His courts had become centers of learning where scholars preserved not only the practical knowledge needed for survival in the desert, but also the stories that connected them to their origins. The tale of Hagar's flight, the angel's promise, the well that gave water in the wilderness, the reconciliation between Isaac and Ishmael at Abraham's tomb, the younger princes Adbeel and Mibsam, Mishma and Duma, Massa and Tema, Jeter and Naphish and Kedemah had each carved out their own portions of the vast Arabian peninsula, establishing kingdoms that bore their names and would endure long after their founders had joined their ancestors in the sleep of the just. Their descendants would spread across the known world, carrying with them the fierce independence and the unshakable faith that had sustained their forefathers through generations of wandering and settlement. As Ishmael lay dying, his mind drifted back across the decades to that moment when he and Isaac had stood together beside their father's grave, two brothers who had been divided by the jealousies and fears of their elders, but who had found in shared grief the path to reconciliation. He remembered the words Isaac had spoken as they lowered Abraham's body into the cave of Machpelah. "We are both sons of promise." Different promises, perhaps, but promises nonetheless. Those words had proved prophetic in ways that neither brother could have imagined at the time. The promises made to Isaac had indeed been fulfilled. His descendants had become the people of Israel, the nation through whom all the families of the earth would be blessed, the line through which the Messiah would come to offer redemption to all humanity. But the promises made to Ishmael had been equally faithful to their divine origin. His 12 sons had become princes ruling over vast territories. His descendants had multiplied beyond counting. His name had become synonymous with the mastery of wilderness survival and the arts of desert warfare. Yet there was more to come. Ishmael knew more than any mortal eye could see or human mind could comprehend. The prophets of Israel spoke of a time when the divisions that had marked Abraham's household from the beginning would finally be healed, when the children of covenant and the children of exile would discover that they had always been part of the same story, participants in the same divine drama of redemption and restoration. Isaiah's vision burned bright in the desert night. "All the flocks of Kedar shall be gathered to you, the rams of Nebaioth shall minister to you. They shall come up with acceptance on my altar, and I will glorify the house of my glory." This was no mere political prophecy, but a promise that transcended the boundaries of time and nation, a vision of ultimate reconciliation that would be fulfilled when the Messiah returned to establish his kingdom on earth. In that future day, the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael would worship together in Jerusalem, their offerings ascending from the same altar, their voices joining in the same songs of praise. The well where the angel had provided water in the desert would become a fountain flowing with the grace that encompasses all nations, all peoples, all the scattered children of the earth. The divisions created by human fear and jealousy would be swept away by divine love, and the promise made to Abraham that through his seed all the families of the earth would be blessed would find its ultimate fulfillment. As the last breath left Ishmael's lungs, and his spirit departed to join the great cloud of witnesses who had gone before, the 12 princes understood that they were witnessing not an ending, but a transition. Their father had lived to see the fulfillment of the angel's promise, had watched his sons become rulers of nations, had witnessed the establishment of a confederation that would endure through the rise and fall of empires. Now it fell to them to carry forward the legacy he had built, to ensure that the memory of the well in the wilderness would never be forgotten, to maintain the fierce independence and unshakable faith that had marked their bloodline since the days when their ancestor had learned to draw water from hidden sources in the harsh embrace of the desert. They buried Ishmael in the desert he had made his kingdom, and the mourning that rose from their camps could be heard across the vast distances of Arabia. But even as they mourned, they understood that their father's death marked not the end of his story, but its continuation in new forms, through new generations, in ways that would surprise and astound those who thought they understood the limits of divine grace. The ram's horn passed to Nebaioth, as was fitting for the eldest son, but its voice would continue to echo across the desert spaces, long after all who heard it that day had joined their ancestors in the sleep of the just. In that echoing call could be heard the promise that the God who hears would never stop listening, that the covenant established beside a well in the wilderness would endure until the day when all of Abraham's children would gather around the same altar, their offerings ascending together like incense before the throne of the Most High. The sun set over the vast Arabian peninsula on the day they buried Ishmael, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to reflect the glory of promises fulfilled and the hope of greater fulfillments yet to come. The black goat-hair tents of his people dotted the landscape like stars fallen to earth, each one a point of light in the gathering darkness of a world that had not yet learned to recognize the full scope of divine mercy. In the years that followed, the descendants of Ishmael would play their appointed roles in the unfolding drama of human history. Some would serve as allies to the people of Israel, bringing their wealth and their wisdom to the service of God's purposes. Others would stand as adversaries, fulfilling the prophecy that Ishmael's hand would be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. But all would remain part of the same story, participants in the same covenant, children of the same promise that had been spoken beside a well in the wilderness where a mother's tears had moved the heart of heaven. The voice that had spoken to Hagar in her distress, the voice that had called Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees, the voice that had wrestled with Jacob through the long night and blessed him with a new name. This same voice continued to speak through the generations, calling all who would listen to recognize that the promises of God are as vast as the desert sky and as enduring as the stars that wheel in their courses above the tents of the faithful. In the end, the story of Ishmael was not a tale of rejection, but of inclusion, not a narrative of exclusion, but of expansion, not the chronicle of a promise denied, but of a covenant that proved large enough to encompass all the children of faith, all the seekers after truth, all who would hear the voice that calls across the wilderness and respond with hearts open to the infinite possibilities of divine grace. The well in the wilderness still gives water to those who are dying of thirst. The angel's promise still echoes in the desert wind. And the descendants of the boy who was saved by divine intervention continue to play their role in the unfolding drama of redemption, witnesses to the truth that God indeed hears the cry of the afflicted and answers with the gift of life itself, with the promise of nations yet unborn, with the certainty that his covenant love extends to all who call upon his name. The ram's horn sounds across the desert spaces still, its voice carrying the memory of reconciliation accomplished and the hope of greater reconciliations yet to come, proclaiming to all who have ears to hear that the story of the first family is far from over, that the promises made to Abraham encompass more than any single generation can comprehend, and that the God who heard Hagar's cry in the wilderness continues to hear the voices of all who seek him with sincere hearts, ready to provide water in the desert, hope in despair, and the assurance that no child of promise will ever be forgotten or forsaken.